Despicable Me is one of the most popular franchises of all time. No matter what you think of the series nowadays, whether you think it's gone down in quality or it's just stayed the same, one thing for sure, it's a massively successful franchise. And not because of how much Minion merchandise they try to shove down your face, it's also because of how black and white the films are in terms of story. You have a villain turned hero fighting another villain, while also injecting a sense of family dynamics into them and also some slapstick comedy for the minions. Simply, they're films that you know what to expect when you watch one of them. And that aside from the minions, that is what made the franchise so popular. Because in some way, these movies really resonate with a lot of people. And while I do agree with the fact that the series has definitely declined in quality, they're still huge money-making machines, so it doesn't really matter in the long term. No matter how terrible they get, they'll still find a way to get kids in seats. And that would even include adults like me. Now I could go on and on about the Despicable Me franchise on how it went from being good and being bad and then this and then that, blah blah blah. But I'm not here to talk about the Despicable Me movies in any way. I'm gonna be talking about the lore of them. Because for some reason, the lore of the franchise is some of the most confusing shit I've ever seen. So, join me as I basically waste my adult years talking about a kid's movie lore that absolutely no one is gonna give a shit about. Part 1. Established lore. So before I get into the reason why I think the lore is very confusing, I think it's best we work up our way in the series. So for this section, I'm going to be focusing about the two movies. And then we'll just go up and up and up, and then you'll see why I think the lore is confusing. But for now, let's focus on the first two movies. So from the first two movies, we can get a basic understanding as to why Gru became the thing he is now. It is established that he is born somewhere in between 1960, as seen in a clip of the first film that shows Gru's date of birth. And it is said that the movie takes place in the year that the movie was released, 2010. If we apply that logic to the 1969 moon landing, that means that Gru was 8 in 1969. We could also see what Gru's home life was in both school and at home itself, with his mother basically ignoring everything he did and everyone at school distancing from him, which establishes that Gru became a villain because of his terrible childhood, and that the moon landing he saw as a child is basically the main reason he wants to steal the moon. So now that we've established Gru in a simple way, let's move on to the girls. Not much is known about their initial origin story, but what we do know is that before they met Gru, they spent their whole childhood at an orphanage, where they were forced to go out and sell cookies by Miss Hattie, who put them under pressure to sell a lot of cookies. The ages of the girls are 12, 8, and 5 respectively, which leads me to believe that not all of them were born to the same mother, but they bonded over one another, which is also backed up by Miss Hattie calling them girls instead of sisters. And that is most of the lore that we can interpret from Despicable Me 1 and 2. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, when we get to the next section, you're already gonna see how confusing it gets. Part 2. Minions, 2015, rated PG, featuring Dante from the Devil May Cry series. Now, here's a question that you probably did not ask yourself when you were watching the video. Why did I split the franchise into two sections? Well, the reason is because it's literally the main reason I made the video. The thing that differentiates the franchise is that the first two movies are very simple in terms of lore. You know, Gru born, Gru have bad childhood, Gru go into a villain, Gru steal moon, Gru, he does things. But post Minions, and it feels like the whole lore is just very confusing. Not in terms of adding depth to the story, but more so changing the story. And this is why I'm here today to discuss to you about the lore post Minions. Seeing as this is supposed to be an origin story to the Minions, let's start off with the Minions' origins. So going off with the intro, it is said that the Minions have been around longer than humans, where throughout the years they've had many bosses through many eras. And after their fuck up with Napoleon, they retreat to a snow cave. And if this scene is supposed to be taking place in 1821, the same year that Napoleon died, and that the three minions didn't leave the cave until 1968, which is where Minions takes place, this would mean that the minions have been living in a cave for almost 147 years. The movie also provides the birth of the minions, as seen by the film's intro, which presents them as genetically mutated tadpoles, seeing as they share the same development cycle as a frog. This presents a continuity issue where it's established that minions are genetically modified corn kernels, which also links to the theory that Gru created the minions alongside Dr. Nefario, which the movie disproves by showing the minions in large quantities. This could, however, lead to a theory that Gru used the establishing minions to create new minions. Speaking of Gru, while he's not in the film for very long, there are 2 scenes with him, and these scenes provide more lore to Gru. Starting off with Gru's cameo at VillainCon. We could see him at Dr. Nefario's booth with his mother. To this movie, this should be how Dr. Nefario and Gru first met up. We could also see Gru's mother alongside Gru, which leads to a question as to why she brought him there. Best guess scenario, Gru begged his mother to take him and she ultimately relented. But moving on to the very last scene, which Gru is again featured. This is to the story's lore, where Gru and the minions first meet up. This scene also provides us with a lot of things that I will now go over. First off, Carl is seen alongside Gru, and considering that Carl is not specified as a dog, this means that Carl is a different kind of breed that is immortal. But if we take into account dog years in here, and considering that Carl is way smaller than his first appearance in Despicable Me, this would make him under 6 months, which in turn would make him 42 in Despicable Me, or in dog years, 181. Furthermore, it is supposed to be established that Gru is supposedly 4 or 5 in Minions. But despite that, it seems like his voice is more deeper than when he was 8.
Look, Mom, I drew a picture of me landing on the moon. Hey, Lisa, I was wondering if you...
Give me the books.
No, I don't think so.
And it's gonna be even weirder when we go deep into this, but for now, let's move on to Despicable Me 3. Now there is something I want to mention about Despicable Me 3 outside of the obvious. This is something briefly alluded in Minions, but is on full display in Despicable Me 3. They even amped this up with the reveal of Gru's long-lost father, who was known as the Bald Terror and was known as the greatest supervillain ever. It is also shown that Gru comes from a long line of villains, and that Gru's dad was aware of Gru's villainy, and that he was more supportive of Gru over Drew despite never seeing Gru. While it is interesting to hear a new layer about how Gru became a villain, there is also a negative to this. I know this is a video about the lore and I don't want to go too off-board, so I'm gonna keep this concise. The destined for villainy reason as to why Gru became a villain in the first place feels like it ruins the first 2 movies. Going back to part 1, it is stated that Gru became a villain because of social neglect. Of course, it was never flat out said, but it was mostly implied. But that implication added a lot more to Gru. It was convincing in a way that you understood Gru as to why he chose to take that path. Considering that Gru was both ostracized in school and by his mother, it could be possible that Gru never got any help as a kid and was basically forced to fend for himself. Another thing worth mentioning about Gru is that his plan to steal the moon, where he tells his minions that once he does it, he'll be known as the greatest villain of all time. Which, looking back, there is a possibility that Gru became a villain just to impress his mother. And all these combined make up for a pretty convincing reason as to why Gru became a villain. You both understand and empathize him without actually supporting him. And that's why in the main plot of Gru adopting the 3 kids, that's why it makes it strong. Because Gru is coming to terms with the decision to either continue the villainy or change his ways. And throughout the movie, Gru definitely does selfish things with the girls. But when he starts actually bonding and having a good time with them, that's when he starts questioning himself. He probably realized that he was becoming no different from his mom when he was a child. So when he goes against Vector to rescue the girls, it makes him more impactful. So to have that all washed out in favor of, oh, Gru was always destined to be a villain, is just really stupid. You basically made the first movie look so weak because you just decided to ignore that and just dumb it down. Also, it inherently creates a plot hole in between Despicable Me 2 and 3. Because in the Minions movie, it is established that the Minions are only there to serve evil. So why is that when Despicable Me 2 happens when Gru gives up villainy, why didn't they just quit? One possibility may be because of how loyal they are to Gru, just as much as Gru is loyal to them. Or it could be that the telling that they are only there to serve evil isn't true at all. But my argument against it is that they are very adamant on Gru returning to villainy and even quit in front of his face because he doesn't want to return to villainy. Them quitting in front of Gru shows that even though they're loyal, they still have standards. See, this is one of the dangers of when you retcon a series. Because if you're not careful, you can end up making more plot holes and therefore make the series more confusing. And if you thought that it could get any worse than this, well, it does. Minions 2: The Rise of Gru. There is a lot of stuff I want to talk about with this movie, because in my opinion, this is one of the worst culprits as to why the Despicable Me lore is confusing. So first, let's start with Gru. Obviously, as this is a sequel to Minions, this of course is in the same canon, which means that in the previous film, Gru was 4 or 5. And in this movie, Gru states that he is 11 and a half. And considering that Gru's mum states in one line that Halloween was 4 months ago, this means that the film takes place on a February. It is also stated that in the film's intro, this takes place in 1976, which is a very strong indication that this Gru was born in 1964. But the bizarre thing is that the film tries to be canon to Despicable Me, but Gru's birth dates don't align with one another. Another thing that doesn't seem to align is Gru's house. As we can see from this flashback from Despicable Me 1, it shows that Gru has lived in the same house for all his life. But in this movie, Gru is instead living in a suburban neighborhood. These changes add to the possibility that both Despicable Me 1 and 2 are not canon. But in a weird way they try to be. Like if you're trying to assure us that both Despicable Me 1 and 2 are canon, then why are the timelines so inconsistent? You can't just rewrite lore and expect everyone to think it's canon. And even worse, it feels like the sequel even disrespects the first Minions movie. Case in point, Dr. Nefario. Remember when I said there was a scene in Minions 1 where Gru met Dr. Nefario at VillainCon, and also Gru at the end of the movie? Well, I want you to focus on the freeze ray, because it seems like Minions 2 has just thrown all that out to create a new story. Now in this one, this is the first time that Dr. Nefario and Gru meet each other. One thing I neglected to talk about in Minions is that at the end of it, Gru is shown with the freeze ray. This would imply two things. 1, Gru and Dr. Nefario have already established a team-up with each other, or 2, Dr. Nefario gave Gru his own freeze ray. But both are completely thrown out the window because in this movie's terms, this is supposed to be when Gru and Dr. Nefario met for the first time. Also at the end of the movie, you could clearly see a freeze ray when Dr. Nefario is packing up his things. And in the film's intro, Gru is using something called a cheese ray, obviously meant to be a callback to the first Despicable Me movie. But where did Gru's actual freeze ray go? And if we were led to believe that that same freeze ray he used in Minions is the same one he has now, why would he need to persuade to Dr. Nefario that he needs the freeze ray? It's one thing to retcon the first movie in your prequel movie, but it's another thing when your prequel sequel retcons the first prequel movie. And look, I know that Despicable Me is not really a franchise made up of artistic integrity, but when you start pulling shit like this just for the sake of story, that's when it becomes a problem for me. But for the sake of my own sanity, let's just fucking move on. So now we move up to the most recent Despicable Me movie, Despicable Me 4. Thankfully, there's not much to go over, so thank Lord to my sanity. But there are still two things that I want to outline to add to the lore. In the opening scene, we get more added lore to Gru's childhood, which is Gru re-attending his high school for a reunion. The name of the high school is Lycée de Mal, which is High School of Evil in French. The reunion is predictively titled Class of 85 Reunion. And if we consider that Gru was born somewhere in between 1964 in this canon, then it would be odd for Gru to be attending high school when he was probably around 20 to 21. Also in Despicable Me 4, there is also a flashback which is relating to Maxime Lamal, the main villain, as he details at one point where Gru stole his song for a talent show. And the weird thing is that despite being in high school, Gru looks like he hasn't aged a single day. Shouldn't he be having like some sort of growth spurt or something? And I've obviously neglected to talk about it because it kind of bears repeating into dust, but why is his voice so inconsistent? He's either deep or high pitched, there is absolutely no in between. But moving on, let's move on to the girls. Something I'm gonna finally talk about. Some recent news was that Chris Renaud, the director for Despicable Me 4, said that they would not be aging the characters. So for every baby that introduces, Margot, Edith, and Agnes are still going to be the same age as before. And the weird thing is that they have actually aged in some capacity. But even then, their aging is all over the place. One weird occurring thing with the Despicable Me sequels is that for every single one of them, one of the girls' age is up. For example, in the first movie, Agnes is 5, turning 6 in Despicable Me 2. In Despicable Me 3, Edith goes from 8 to 9, and in Despicable Me 4, Margot goes from 12 to 13. So how do their birthdays work in general? The best possible theory is that there is a secret timer, because if the directors are using the Simpsons effect on Despicable Me, then it's possible that the directors have a specific timer for the girls to age up, and then after they age up, well, they're just the same age forever. Because think about it, it goes from Agnes to Edith to Margot. They have a specific timer for all of the three, and they're just basically working their way up the ladder. And now that all the girls have aged up, well, there's no reason to age them anymore. The effect is complete, and everyone can go home. And that is pretty much all of the lore post-Minions. Part 3, trying to actually make the lore understandable. So now that I've burned through every single bit of my sanity just to explain the Despicable Me lore, I think the best way to end the video is to take the lore and make it more concise. So without further ado, let's just get on with it. So first thing we can inquire is that Despicable Me 1 and 2 are not canon. Sure, they're referenced in Minions 2, but that doesn't make them canon, does it? Both have two very clear different origin stories for Gru. And seeing that Gru's origin story about him being destined for villainy is more prevalent in the post-Minions films, then it's obvious that the first Despicable Me's backstory is kind of non-canon. Well, why do I say kinda not canon? Well, let me explain. You see, the reason as to why Gru became a villain because of neglect is not canon anymore, but what is canon is that he was definitely ostracized for it. I like to imagine that Gru's reason as to why he became a villain is because he is emotionally stunted, and that he's only doing so just to make his mother proud instead of making him proud. I also like to think the way Gru treats people is his way of coping, which he combines that with villainy in order to cope with his past trauma. But he only seemed to do it with people he knew instead of people who knew him. And obviously that comes down to trust. Considering that Dr. Nefario and Gru have been longtime partners, it's obvious who Gru would value more. Speaking of Dr. Nefario and Gru's partnership, let's talk about that. So as I said before, Gru is supposed to be around 4 or 5 in Minions. And as previously mentioned, Gru met Dr. Nefario and VillainCon in the same time frame, and fast forward to 1976 is when they reunite again. So let's start off on why Dr. Nefario doesn't recognize Gru. So seeing in the second movie that Dr. Nefario used to work at a record shop, and that same record shop also housed the Vicious Six, this could imply that Dr. Nefario came from humble beginnings. And while we don't know much about Dr. Nefario's family, it's best to assume that they probably didn't like what Dr. Nefario wanted to do as an adult. This is because despite how Dr. Nefario presents himself in the Minions movies, him having both the freeze ray and the sticky figures probably implies that he made them before his parents kicked them out. Moving on to why Dr. Nefario and Gru didn't recognize each other, considering that VillainCon is something that happens once a year, it's possible that Dr. Nefario just erased Gru out of his memory. He probably wouldn't give a rat's ass about 1968. So in both meeting Gru and also giving Gru the freeze ray is something that he's probably not gonna care about. And as to why Gru probably didn't recognize Dr. Nefario, it's either he doesn't remember it clearly or I don't know. But if he didn't recognize it at all, how does he have the freeze ray in the first movie? It's entirely possible that Dr. Nefario didn't just make one freeze ray, but my theory is that Gru has actually owned 2 freeze rays, one from himself and one from Nefario. The freeze ray that Gru has in the first Minions movie was probably one that Dr. Nefario gave him, and while it isn't exactly stated as to why he switched it to a cheese ray, it's probably because his mother confiscated it, which is obviously to do with her disdain of Gru wanted to become a villain. Then fast forward into Minions 2 when Gru and Dr. Nefario unexpectedly reunite. And seeing as this is the first time they team up with one another, this means that the freeze ray that Gru has now is the one that Dr. Nefario gave to him when they first teamed up. As to where the first freeze ray ended up to, it was most likely thrown out. One final thing I want to say about Gru is his time at high school. Obviously in the flashbacks it looks like he hasn't aged a day. My theory is that Gru has something called neuroteric complex syndrome, which is a disorder that basically prevents someone from aging up. But if Gru supposedly has this syndrome, how did he manage to age up in the first movie? Presumably it might be because he may have a different case, where until he is an adult, he just looks like a kid even if he's 17. And then in his 20s he just shot up in terms of aging, and how he was considered into the class of 85 despite being 20 in the continuity if we establish that Gru was born in 1964, it's possible that Gru did actually go to high school, and either due to bad behavior or massive bullying, he dropped out. It's best to imagine he dropped out at 17, considering that most high schools go on for 4 years. For him to be part of class of 85, he would have had to been enrolled in 1981, which would line up with the prediction that Gru was actually born in 1964. And moving on to Minions, it's obvious that the origin of them being genetically modified corn kernels is not canon. The origin that the Minions movie gives for the Minions is supposed to be canon, considering that some of the aspects like Gru always being destined for villainy and that Minions only need to serve evil bled into the actual series. And that is everything I have to say about the Despicable Me lore. Finally, after all of that, I can just put it to rest, ease, and just focus on other